so I think there's like this idea of what or who a children's book author or illustrator is. But, as I said, and as we've shared, like we have our hands and feet involved in lots of different things and lots of different projects. And so like being a children's book author is just one of many, many things that I do. And I also would never want to be like, reduced is maybe not the word I want to use, but like reduced to like just that, not that there's anything wrong with being just a children's book author, but I think there's something important about allowing myself the space to kind of create or facilitate or to do whatever it is that I want to do, kind of without that restriction. And so, yeah, whether it's, one thing that I'm like really passionate about and a lot of my work is actually around sex ed. And even though, my original training was youth focused, obviously we live in a society where we still have a lot of taboo and discomfort talking about sex. And so even like having that conversation at the same time as talking about children makes people really, really uncomfortable for like very valid and understandable reasons. But I'm really just interested in kind of like occupying all of those different spaces, like in all of that complexity. And another thing I think that's interesting is, probably most of like my work is around either race or kind of speaking to oppression more broadly. And, not always in like the friendliest ways. And so I think there's something that's also interesting about like what people expect. And so I think about like, someone might invite me to kind of talk about Dear Black Girls and, kind of focus on diversity and inclusion. But then they're going to get really uncomfortable when I start talking about like white supremacy. And I think it's like really important that we're able to kind of hold space for that full conversation, right? Because you can't talk about diversity and inclusion without talking about the reasons why those things have to exist, which is white supremacy, right? So I think it's like, how do we open up space for those, again, as I said, those hard conversations. And I actually think the book is a really incredible kind of entry point for those conversations. And there are like, explicit parts of the book where we can really kind of talk about those things, but other ones that are not so explicit. And that was a goal as well, whether it's through the words or through the illustrations, to kind of open up space for conversation with young people and with the people who are reading this book with them, which are often parents or educators or just like adult friends in their life. And I wanted people to be able to like have those, tough but important conversations together. And I think that's also really important, is that we like do that together and not in isolation. And so I think it's exciting, I think, to be able to wear multiple hats, but it for sure, I think, complicates things in terms of how we either introduce ourselves or like what spaces we're going to be invited to, or what spaces, we might not have like the same access. And as a poet as well, like a big theme in my poetry, especially in like my earlier poetry, is erotica. And so I'm sure like people would be really uncomfortable with that. And then, as I said, talking about race, I'm not always in friendly ways. And so I often like curse in my poetry. And so whenever I perform somewhere, I always like check in to be like, hey, is it okay if I swear? Just because, again, like people have like all different feelings for all different reasons about, what we might call kind of like explicit content. And so I do my part to kind of like check in, but it makes me think about like, that thing about us being uncomfortable with like talking about these things that are important, hard but important. And so I just feel like that's a really key part of my work, which is like taking these really complex and difficult conversations and breaking them down into a way where we can talk about it and where we can unpack it and we can like move through it together.
I agree with everything you said. And I like that you said that Dear Black Girls was an entry point to these conversations. I thought the same, but I've never heard it said, and I think it just makes sense. I think that it's hard. Like when you're an artist and you're interested in so many things and you want to talk about different things and be allowed to, not allowed to specifically, but just like people, I feel like they like you to do one thing in a way. I find like, oh, that person does that, but like like humans are so complex and we have different interests and we want to try things. I think it's, at least for myself, it's an important reminder to be like, hey, you're allowed to do whatever you want. It's your work. It's for fun in a way. Like it's, I don't know, like sometimes let's say I want to paint something and only use, like I use a lot of pastel-y colors, but sometimes I'm like, oh, I want to use like dark orange and just like darker colors. Or like, oh, are people going to think it's weird? And even if I always end up doing it, the fact that I ask myself that questions, especially lately, I'm like, oh no, but I'm allowed to do what I want. And I think it's a great thing to remind ourselves. And that things are not always separated at all. Like there's a cause effect in a lot of things, just like white supremacy and the reason for the Black girls, right? I think what's funny is when I started telling friends and all that I was going to illustrate a children's book, and that they haven't seen it, they were like, oh, you really? Because in my work, there's a lot of like naked people or just like a lot of nudity and themes that are just not necessarily seen as a children book material. So I think it was, it was a funny experience. I think people were like, oh, but how is she going to do it? What is it going to be? Are they going to be dressed? What is this?
And I'm sure, I'm just thinking like maybe that was also probably what like attracted me to your art as well, like all of the naked people. I was like, this is who I want, and so let's see how we can like adapt this for the children's book. But yeah, I just, as you said, like it's, I think it's important that we get to be exactly who we are, and all of like the dimensions of that as well. I think especially as Black girls, as Black women, like we just really are not offered that space, to be who we are. And so that feels incredibly important that we are able to kind of reclaim that and to be bold, and to create the art that we want to create in the way that we want to do it.
Definitely.